Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Medisodes. I'm here with Adrian, Anupam and Shrey. Today we are going to be talking about neuroplasticity, which is a relatively new but exciting field of medicine, which has great potential. So to get things started, let us look at what neuroplasticity actually encompasses. The main focus of neuroplasticity is the brain. For a long time, scientists have thought that the brain develops when you are young and development finishes off when you reach the age of 25. It was also thought that once the brain is damaged, repairing it is impossible without surgery. Recent research has shown that both these ideas are misconceptions, and neuroplasticity can help us understand why these ideas are misconceptions. Recent advances in brain imaging have shown that the brain is very plastic. This means that the neurons in the brain can be rewired through a person's lifetime. Throughout an individual's life, they are constantly exposed to stimuli, which creates and strengthens neural pathways in the brain. Since the embryonic stages of life, your brain is constantly changing. When a baby is born, it is exposed to a wide variety of stimuli, all of which create neural networks. As experiences are repeated, the neural pathways associated with these experiences are strengthened. This is called synaptic reinforcement. By the time you reach the age of 3, you have reached your peak number of synapses. But after a certain age, you realize that not all of the information that you have learnt is entirely correct, accurate, or relevant to you. The neural pathways related to these ideas are weakened due to them not being used. Slowly over time, these pathways are lost, and this is known as synaptic pruning. This molding of the brain in response to stimuli is known as neuroplasticity. If you think of a garden hedge, it grows continuously over time and gets bigger. But gardeners will prune the hedge so that only the main body of the hedge remains. Though not a perfect analogy, it helps to get a rough idea of what neuroplasticity involves. Neuroplasticity shows how flexible the brain is, and this applies to the brains of all age groups. This flexibility can be utilized in many ways. In this episode, we will be looking at how neuroplasticity can help with memory and learning, how it can be used to treat mental health conditions, and how it can help people recover from strokes and other disabilities. So now on to Adrian.
So neuroplasticity plays a fundamental role in the development of memory and the learning of an individual. Neuroplasticity is a hot topic in research, for the more we understand about how the brain works, new ways of improving education can be developed, making learning more efficient. But what is the role that neuroplasticity plays in memory and learning? Learning can be defined as the changing and strengthening of neural connections and networks in the brain. The initial focus of research into neuroplasticity was on how brain plasticity changes with age, and the possible implications of starting education later or earlier, and when various skills should be taught. However, it also makes sense to research the different constraints that act in the different parts of the brain. For example, this allows for the determination of how much time should be spent learning different types of skills, or for the determination of the optimal age at which people should learn particular skills. Let us focus on the effect of age on learning. The current view is that there are few brain constraints as one ages, with respect to high-level cognitive abilities, unless these skills are dependent and reliant on the acquisition of new low-level motor and sensory skills that should have been acquired at an earlier age. However, other age-related factors make it seem as if aging results in a reduction in neuroplasticity. One of these is the change in learning style with age. A younger child will learn more implicit skills, but as they grow older, they switch to a more explicit, focused learning style. A prominent example, however, of how age impacts on learning ability is language learning. The ability to discriminate sounds outside a first language is reduced after the first 6 months of life. This does not prevent the learning of languages later on, but adults may require greater amounts of practice and time to achieve fluency, and there may be a limit to how proficient one can become in a language learnt as an adult compared to that learnt as a younger child. A child of age 3 has an estimated 15,000 synapses per neuron, but the average adult has about half that number. Why is this the case? As we gain new experiences, some connections are strengthened while others are eliminated. It remains unclear for sure whether plasticity of the brain deteriorates over time, for there is evidence supporting either hypothesis. The complexity of the brain makes experimentation harder, and there are so many different variables for each organism that make comparisons hard to make a decisive conclusion. We must make sure not to confuse the terms neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, though they may sound like they refer to the same thing. Neurogenesis refers, instead of changes to the brain structure to the formation of new neurons. There is more evidence that suggests a decrease in neurogenesis with age, for adults are more likely to have the neurons they need in their brain compared to a younger child with a developing brain. We must also note that the brain is not infinitely plastic. Certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain functions, and damage to key areas can result in deficits in brain functionality for those aspects, for other parts of the brain cannot simply take over those tasks. Now I'll hand over to Anupam, who will be talking about how neuroplasticity can be used to treat mental health conditions.
So, neuroplasticity, by its very nature, allows for the brain to change the way it functions, and so it holds massive potential for the treatment of mental health conditions, which are, to simply put it, diseases of the mind. However, in many cases, it can also be the cause of these mental health conditions. With further scientific study, humans have been able to use our neuroplasticity for the better. Let's start with addiction. It's a very common mental health condition found from people of all walks of life for things such as smoking, alcohol, sex, and many types of drug. Addiction occurs in large part because of the brain's neuroplasticity. It becomes very easy for the brain to create the neural pathways that form the positive feedback loops that fuel addiction, especially if there's strong positive feedback, as is the case for many addictive substances. However, it's the same neuroplasticity that can help reserve the damage being caused. Methods such as mindfulness-based relapse prevention, or MBRP, can help restructure the brain away from those neural pathways created by addiction by avoiding triggers of the feedback loops and returning to the old pathways the brain had before. Things such as exercise as well has similar effects. However, in this case, it creates new pathways above the addictive pathways. Depression is another very common mental health condition and follows a similar pattern to addiction. However, in this instance, it's not positive feedback loops causing the mental health condition, but instead neural circuits that tend towards a pattern of depression. When these become excited or activated repeatedly, it makes them the default condition for the brain to follow and could overwrite the previous happy neural pathways. And in most cases, they become very deep-rooted in someone's psyche. Depression is also very similar to PTSD, another mental health condition. This affects not just soldiers, although they're most associated with the condition, but anyone who's experienced trauma can end up having PTSD. In many studies, PTSD and depression have shown that they can cause smaller hippocampal volume in the brain, significantly smaller than those who've never developed the conditions. However, interestingly, those who have recovered from these mental health conditions have hippocampal volumes equivalent to unaffected brains, suggesting strongly that it is possible to heal from this utilizing neuroplasticity. For example, antidepressant medications have proven to reverse the effects of chronic stress on the brain and can even reverse the hippocampal volume deficits in PTSD and depression. Other studies, although smaller and less widespread, have tested electroconvulsive therapy or shock therapy as a way of stimulating the brain to increase synaptic density and hippocampal neurogenesis. Other types of brain stimulation, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, and deep brain stimulation, have also been tested for treatment of various conditions. These all work on the same premise of building new neural pathways above the mental health condition affected neural pathways. This can even work in chronic mental health conditions, such as ADHD. People with ADHD, whether they be children or adults, have smaller amygdalas, chordates, and hippocampuses. However, long-term treatment with common ADHD medical stimulants, such as amphetamines, can actually decrease these abnormalities in brain structure and function found in subjects with ADHD. Neuroplasticity, however, does not just treat mental health conditions, but can even heal physical disabilities, as Shrey will now talk about.
One of the biggest killers globally is stroke. Luckily, over the last few years, due to medical advancements, we're better able to treat strokes, so you're less likely to die from a stroke, and this has led to a slight decrease in stroke deaths. However, the number of people getting strokes has actually increased, and this means that more and more people are living with the effects of strokes. Strokes can cause debilitating changes to a person, such as making it harder to walk, struggling with even basic tasks like speaking, maybe even eating, depending on the severity of the stroke. And therefore, it's increasingly become more important that we have rehabilitation for these people who have suffered from strokes. And this is where neuroplasticity comes in. Through rehabilitation, we can retrain the brain to do these basic tasks, and we can help stroke sufferers return to their previous life. The most effective treatments have been with exercise. Exercising improves motor skills and coordination, which people may have lost after they've had their stroke. And after a few years, you might not even be able to tell that they had a stroke. It's amazing that you can go from having a blood clot in your brain that nearly killed you to even just return to normality is a huge achievement. But we need investment in rehabilitation services so that those with strokes are able to recover. Many people who've had strokes don't have the support needed, and that means they suffer. It's not good enough that patients just survive. They should also be able to thrive and live their lives after having a stroke. And with this greater investment in rehabilitation services for stroke patients, hopefully this can help more and more people.
So the idea of utilizing neuroplasticity is very exciting, especially since it can help avoid unnecessary invasive surgery on the brain, considering the fact that it carries risks such as infection, permanent brain damage, paralysis, and bleeding. So what do you guys think about the future potential of neuroplasticity?
I think neuroplasticity has great potential to be used by humans. I think right now what's limiting us is our understanding of how neuroplasticity works. However, in the future, as more research is done, I definitely think it can be useful in solving problems such as mental health conditions and stroke victims.
The brain is a very complex organ, and I think that we need to understand it better and how the different parts of the brain interact with each other in order to get the maximum benefit out of these treatments.
I think that if we can unlock the key to the brain, then we can fix or at least treat a lot of disabilities. That will allow for much more effective treatment for people with problems with their brain. Currently, the brain is not understood enough to be able to treat these people, so neuroplasticity holds great potential for treating these people.
So I think these are really good, interesting points. And a good example of a person who has successfully used neuroplasticity to improve their condition is a person called Barbara Young, who used to suffer from a mental block, which is a condition which resulted in her brain having fewer neural pathways. So this meant that she couldn't relate things together. So this made her struggle with activities such as reading the time. So to overcome this, she made flashcards with the time on one side and a picture of the clock showing the time on the other side. And using those eventually allowed her to read the time without making any mistakes. So obviously she had utilized the synaptic reinforcement through repetition of these exercises. But do you think that this can be used as a template for future treatments?
Yeah, I think you have to be able to literally walk before you can run. And especially with strokes, you shouldn't just go and expect to be normal again. It's going to take time, and it's going to be quite literally baby steps until you can return to normality. But if you stick at it, if you dedicate yourself to it, you will be able to recover from it.
I definitely think one place we can look at is how children learn. Neuroplasticity in children is, with increased studies, shown to be quite similar to how adults learn as well. And that example of using flashcards is quite similar to how a lot of children learn to read the time for the first time ever. And so I think maybe studies that look at how children learn could help treat conditions where people have lost higher brain function.
Further to that point, it could also help us create education reform so that we're teaching people in the most effective way. And also it's important to note that people learn in different ways, and that could, if we can improve this, the way we can scan the brain and identify different things, we could create personalized medicine and personalized education.
The point you made about people learning in different ways is a really good point. And it reflects how people have different types of brain, different brain structures, different connections in their brains. Not everyone's brain is going to be identical, and everyone has differences. This is one of the key reasons why neuroplasticity is an area of research right now, and why we don't know much about it. Everyone's brain is different, and there's so many different variables, so many different lifestyle factors and genetic factors. That means that it's almost impossible to get a universal model that represents the human brain on which scientists can experiment and produce treatments for.
I think that's a really good point. Neuroplasticity and the brain in general, we're really only just scratching the surface. I think it will be a long time before we're able to fully understand it. But considering where we are at now, do you guys think neuroplasticity-based treatments such as antidepressant medication or MBRP are the best treatment plan for mental health conditions? Or do you think other alternative options such as CBT have more benefits right now?
Well, I think it's always important to prioritize lifestyle treatments as they have the least side effects. So when we're thinking about prioritizing treatment, lifestyle changes should be the go-to, but if the condition does progress to a more serious state, we might need to consider these.
As Anupam was saying, amphetamines are used to treat some conditions like ADHD, and they've been shown to be quite addictive. So they might have the opposite effect, and we need to be careful, especially with like chemical substances, that we're not overusing them.
And another point I'd like to make about antidepressants and amphetamines is that they are a temporary solution to a permanent problem. And in reality, we don't want that. We want a permanent solution, a permanent cure. And that's what research in neuroplasticity is aiming to develop. And a temporary solution to a permanent problem is like putting off the problem to another point. And though the patient may have an improved quality of life, they'll be stuck using the medication forever unless we have a permanent solution.
So I think we've covered some great points today, and really we've shown how neuroplasticity has a future potential in treatments. So thank you for listening to this week's episode of Medisodes, and remember to like and subscribe for new episodes every week. Thank you.